Greetings, everyone. It's lovely to see you. I hope you have had a good few weeks since we last met. I am introducing our well-known colleague, Robert Tulip, to talk today about faith and religion as it relates to climate change. So I sent out a biography of Robert, even though we know him well, and I'm putting it again in the chat for you to review. But without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Robert.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thanks everyone for joining the discussion today. It's a controversial topic, religion and climate change, and it's something that I've been interested in for a long time. So I'm just going to speak for half an hour, just setting out my own perspectives, and then turn the meeting over to just a broad conversation about issues that come up. So as I said in the note that was circulated, religion has an ambiguous relationship with climate science. On the one hand, conventional religion tends to promote comforting, escapist, emotional fantasies, and as a result has a negative role, and deflecting attention from the pragmatic problems of a warming planet and enabling the spread of harmful myths. But on the other hand, the religious hope for salvation of the world can be seen in a positive and a pragmatic way. We can ask how we can foster the future flourishing of humanity. Achieving a goal of sustained peace and prosperity would require us to reverse the current trajectory towards civilizational collapse due to warming, and instead create a vision of a planetary transformation toward a stable and orderly world. So religious framing of central moral values of truth and love and justice can help us to build a brighter world, physically, culturally, emotionally, if these values can be grounded in practical reform. I have a long-standing research interest in the relationship between Christianity and existential philosophy, and that has led me to the view that heretical forms of Christianity can offer vital insights, supporting strategic response to the climate emergency that can give an ethical priority to science. My presentation covers some material I will discuss in a paper to the 14th International Bonhoeffer Congress in January 2024 on how the thought of the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer can support effective strategies to mitigate climate change. The role of religion in forming cultural identity and ethical values can have a positive influence on public opinion about climate change. Religious narratives aim to build a compelling shared vision of meaning and purpose and direction. Such religious narratives can only be effective in promoting good policy if they cohere with scientific understanding, aiming to foster dialogue and cooperation between people with conflicting viewpoints, working towards shared understanding. Teachings that build upon religious traditions can leverage climate action by helping to inform the public about how the urgency of climate response and the required priorities support their traditional moral concerns. One example of how religious narratives can be constructive is a shift of the concepts of heaven and hell, away from the old literal myths of afterlife, toward a vision of possible future planetary scenarios, with heaven as the ideal goal and hell as the worst outcomes. That is arguably how the concepts of heaven and hell were first intended, before the meaning was corrupted by popular literal traditions. Such a constructive scientific reform of religion faces strong barriers. Much religious practice is conservative, personal, and emotional, with little interest in the coherence and consistency that are demanded by science. As a result, modern scientific perspectives tend to regard religion as outmoded and irrelevant. Equally, the difficulty of taking on board the latest scientific knowledge means that religious views on climate change are often superficial and incoherent. Secular culture often sees religion as having no useful contribution to public policy, including on climate change, due to the need to separate church and state, and the observation that religious dogmas often conflict with scientific evidence. With about 40% of Americans supporting the untrue beliefs of young earth creationism, there's a sharp social polarization over religion and science, notably in the US, but also in other countries. This social divide flows through into climate policy. Conservative religious views are a barrier to understanding the empirical data that explains global warming and what can be done about it. This is partly due to the cognitive split that religions promote between spirit and nature, imagining human identity in a supernatural and miraculous way rather than a natural context. The progressive political community is mostly dubious about religion because of the perceived moral and epistemic failures of supernatural views. There are progressive forms of religion, but these are not widely known or supported. Steady decline in religious adherence in many countries can partly be attributed to the failure of religion to present a coherent ethical story on the pressing existential concerns raised by emerging issues such as global warming. This situation of polarized contempt between secular and religious communities makes it hard to engage in constructive dialogue. Opposing ideological camps deplore each other, creating tribal hostility that flows through into partisan politics. The ongoing popularity of Donald Trump among conservative evangelical Christians validates their denial of global warming, contrary to all scientific evidence. Climate denial is a form of mythological thinking that contributes to the danger faced by the world, reinforcing the inability to respond effectively to climate risks. Alongside these criticisms of religion, a similar incoherence also appears in secular opinions about climate, indicating that a lack of rationality is a broader feature of human psychology. There's a strong case that progressive ideology offers no good answers on how to reverse global warming. It's becoming clear that the consensus progressive policy of emission reduction alone cannot prevent dangerous climate change. Despite this emerging critique, the popular climate movement vests its hopes in the belief that the only way to mitigate warming is confrontation with fossil fuel interests to phase out the use of hydrocarbons. This belief, termed emission reduction alone, is arguably also a form of mythological thinking that is as irrational as religious myths or climate denial. One of the key progressive myths is the belief that the policy of emission reduction alone is entirely scientific, despite critics pointing to massive practical problems. The progressive consensus wrongly jumps from the true observation that the science is settled on the causes of global warming to the wrong assumption that the science is equally settled on what we can do about it. The strength of mythological reasoning reflects how deeply religious thought patterns are seated in human psychology, with collective delusions proving very durable and attractive. I argue that overcoming this mythological thinking is essential to opening rational dialogue about climate, and that heretical thinking in Christian history provides some useful models to help understand the problem. The rival camps in the political contest over climate change both have their mythologies. There's the false view that global warming is a hoax, and that confronts the equally dubious belief that shutting down fossil fuels should be the main climate priority. I believe there's scope to build bridges across these social divides through a new look at both the content of religion and the content of climate science. Firstly, it's important to understand why the progressive consensus on emission reduction alone is wrong. The US Energy Information Administration recently projected that global CO2 emissions in the energy sector will be 15% higher in 2050 than now, up from the current 35.7 gigatons to 41 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year. There's slim chance of holding emissions to current levels, let alone cutting them to net zero. Fighting against this vast economic and political momentum for ongoing emissions is difficult, possibly even futile. Holding out hope for net zero emissions by 2050 requires a mythological psychology in the face of strong evidence that this goal is not possible without economic collapse. Efforts to speed up decarbonisation can't achieve anything close to the IPCC goal of halving emissions by 2030. The materials, the funds, the permissions, the skilled personnel to transform the energy sector at this pace are simply not available. And the proponents significantly underestimate the costs and the risks. The power of fossil fuel interests in economics, politics, and culture will easily outweigh efforts to enforce emission cuts that go beyond what is commercially viable. This means, as Sultan Al Jaber said at COP28, there's no realistic scenario where phase out of fossil fuels can keep warming below 1.5 degrees. James Hansen has gone further, arguing that even the 2 degrees Celsius goal is dead if policy is limited to emission reductions and plausible CO2 removal. Another myth in scientific and popular thinking about emissions concerns the committed warming from past emissions. Radiative forcing is the technical measure of global warming and is caused by the whole quantum of carbon dioxide that humanity has added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, over 2 trillion tonnes of CO2. Somebody seeking to enter. Just a small proportion of CO2 has converted into stable non-warming chemistry, but most of that 2 trillion tonnes is still causing warming, whether it's in the atmosphere or in the ocean. This radiative forcing would continue even under net zero emissions, slowly bringing temperature and sea level up to restore Earth system equilibrium. Decarbonising the economy can only marginally slow the increase of radiative forcing and can do nothing about committed warming. An emission reduction alone policy would allow the massive loss and damage caused by committed warming to continue, while also allowing the profound security peril of a phase shift into a planetary hothouse, failing to start any cooling until temperature reaches a dangerously high level, with unpredictable system impacts and tipping points. So, if decarbonising is marginal to slowing temperature rise, that does not mean that climate action is impossible. To actually mitigate global warming, a complete paradigm shift is needed, recognising that sunlight reflection methods are the main way to prevent climate collapse, while removal of greenhouse gases gradually develops alongside ongoing emissions, hopefully slower ongoing emissions. With NASA data showing that the world is now darkening by more than 1% per decade, sunlight reflectivity, or albedo, is an urgent climate priority. Albedo can become a far more tractable and effective climate lever than carbon. Albedo technologies such as marine cloud rebrightening, mirrors to enhance Earth reflectivity, and eventually stratospheric aerosol injection all offer potential for fast, safe, cheap, and effective climate responses, subject to scientific review. The underlying message is that the primary climate policy goal should shift from net zero emissions to net zero heating. Unfortunately, the belief that the world economy could rapidly decarbonise is impossible. However, the IPCC uses the hope for rapid action toward net zero emissions as a reason to ignore or even ban solar geoengineering. This creates an immense opportunity cost in the foregone economic, ecological, social benefits of a global focus on increasing sunlight reflection. The failure to slow warming due to this refusal to implement effective policies is leading to an avoidable rise in extreme weather, sea level, biodiversity loss, and the systemic disruptions caused by heat. That all puts the refusal to examine brightening options into a highly negative moral light, in view of the potential of sunlight reflection to mitigate these damaging effects of climate change. A prominent scientific article co-authored by David Keith calculated that a proper scientific research program on solar geoengineering could avoid climate damage costing 5,000 times as much as the research. That's a benefit cost ratio of 5,000 to 1. And yet this whole topic continues to be largely ignored, twisted, or mocked in mass media, in science, and in politics, in a syndrome of mass delusion. The scale of suffering that could be mitigated by higher albedo is immense. Our children will wonder why we have been so slow to act. The cognitive disarray in current climate policies is simply stunning to behold. It seems no one in authority cares about action to actually cool things down, despite the obvious problems of increasing heat. Without higher albedo, it's highly probable that tipping points will completely swamp all carbon-based mitigation. Only albedo increase through sunlight reflection can actually mitigate the immediate effects of warming. The claim that cutting emissions can mitigate climate change is like imagining a 1-foot high levee wall could prevent a 20-foot flood. The false claim that decarbonisation could mitigate climate change has become an orthodoxy, but it involves an Orwellian misuse of language. The use of the term mitigation as a synonym for emission cuts is false and deceptive, creating false hope, and should cease. By contrast, higher albedo could readily mitigate climate change by reducing temperature, working as a planetary tourniquet, a rapid emergency protective response, while the slower actions to fix the carbon problem are addressed. Restricting climate policy to emission reduction alone is like a hospital refusing surgery to a heart attack victim and instead telling them to improve their diet and exercise, effectively leaving them to die. The sudden spike in world temperature in 2023 and events such as the collapse of Antarctic sea ice show that current climate policies often offer no hope of working and are actually exposing the world to severe and unacceptable dangers and security risks, even though workable alternatives exist. The risk to the planetary climate is apocalyptic in scale, described widely as a 6th planetary extinction event, creating a reasonable comparison to religious mythologies of apocalyptic collapse. A growing body of opinion known as doomerism holds that the collapse of modern civilization is inevitable because of the willful blindness of humanity to the need for action on climate change. I reject the doomer view that nothing can be done. Action to brighten the planet can be an effective response, providing the triple benefit of a physically brighter and more reflective climate, an intellectually brighter understanding of the real planetary situation, and an emotionally brighter mood about hopes for a better future. Essentially, brightening the planet can be the starting point for a broader paradigm shift in our global relationship to our planet. But this shift has to be properly sequenced. It's not possible to deliver climate justice when the physical precondition of a stable climate has not yet been achieved through restoration of albedo. How then could religion make a productive contribution to addressing the climate crisis? It has first to be recognised that religion needs to accept a natural scientific worldview to usefully engage on climate policy. The magical supernatural thinking that dominates prevailing religion is of no help, except to the extent that its stories provide metaphors for scientific understanding. A starting point in shifting to a natural perspective on religion is to consider the definition of religion, the meaning of religion. Linguistically, the words religion and ligament share the same Latin origin, which means bind or connect. So our ligaments connect the bones of our skeleton, and similarly, the ideal original purpose of religion is to connect people together with a unified story, like how our ligaments connect our body. Obviously, religion often fails in this goal of bringing people together due to problems of corruption and delusion. But this ideal of connectedness is important to understand as a basis for systematic thinking about moral concerns. The theme of connection is central to Christianity in several ways. The Bible imagines God as manifest in the interconnectedness of all reality, permeating the whole universe. The story of the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ is traditionally imagined as holding the universe together. Texts that support this connecting theme include Romans 1:20, that says God's invisible qualities are clearly perceived in things. John 1, the Word became flesh. Colossians 1:17, in Christ all things hold together. Hebrews 1:3, Christ upholds the universe by his word of power. This theme of divine connectivity itself has a mythological context, yet it also generates systematic approaches to theology that can challenge the popular mythologies in religion. The idea that everything is connected supports a holistic integration of the sacred and the secular through a scientific understanding of how human culture is embedded in natural planetary ecology. The biblical concept of divine grace is a powerful metaphor for the stability of intact ecological systems. In a state of grace, everything is connected in balance and harmony, whereas disrupted ecosystems are in a state of corruption and decline. That leads in turn to an understanding of salvation in secular historical terms, of restoring a state of grace, meaning planetary transformation through values of truth, love, and justice, rather than just seeing salvation as the conventional religious belief in individual afterlife. One of the most dramatic but little known biblical texts that emphasizes this theme of interconnectedness of nature is Revelation 11:18. It says, "The wrath of God will destroy those who destroy the earth." This can be understood to mean that the sanctity of natural ecosystems and the fragility and sensitivity of the earth are primary concerns of God, and that the ancient complexity of nature is intrinsically good and sacred. This biblical connection between divine wrath and ecological collapse aligns directly with the emerging understanding of the fragility of the planetary climate, using this metaphor of divine wrath to depict the impact of the collapse of natural ecosystems. The flip side of this idea of divine anger at human destruction is the teaching of Jesus in the Beatitudes that the meek will inherit the earth at Matthew 5:5. This can be read to see salvation in ecological terms, seeing wild nature as the epitome of meekness in this world of human domination. This metaphor of divine wrath and nature suggests a close connection between the biblical idea of God and the emerging scientific understanding of the Gaia theory, the observation that the complex nature of the Earth system functions like a single organism, maintaining the stability of the biosphere through interconnected feedback mechanisms. This stability, known as homeostasis, is robust until the pressures become too extreme or too sudden and the system collapses, just like the human body. Earth system fragility may be sensitive to smaller impacts than we easily imagine, smaller than the risk of tipping points getting triggered by adding a few trillion tons of CO2 to the air. Gaia theory observes how the biosphere functions as a self-regulating system capable of maintaining conditions suitable for life. As our world economy destroys the Earth, we are creating the risk of the collapse of planetary homeostasis, allowing our planetary home to fall from grace, turning our heavenly home into a living hell. The connectivity of all things is also a central tenet of Eastern religion. The Hindu philosophy of the connection between each individual thing and the whole universe finds expression in the causal doctrines of karma and the cycle of life. These traditions teach that all is one and that our Earth is part of the cosmos. While karma has a superstitious meaning in the doctrine of reincarnation, it can also be understood in purely scientific terms of cause and effect. For example, in the impact of trauma. Newer scientific ideas about religion also promote the concept of causal connectivity, notably Einstein's view that the beauty and order of the universe are worthy of our reverence and awe through admiration of the elegant mathematical structures of nature revealed by science. Seeing the Earth's climate as a complex adaptive system is the focus of the writings of our HPAC colleague, Dr. Robert Chris, who's on this call, in his book, Systems Theory for Geoengineering Policy. This systems idea that everything is connected is central to enabling us to think on a planetary global scale. This theme also found expression in the opening speech at COP28 by King Charles, where he said, "Unless we rapidly repair and restore nature's unique economy based on harmony and balance, which is our ultimate sustainer, our own economy and survivability will be imperiled." King Charles went on to say, "We need to remember too that the indigenous worldview teaches us that we are all connected, not only as human beings, but with all living things and all that sustains life. As part of this grand and sacred system, harmony with nature must be maintained." For King Charles to describe harmony with nature in this way shows how a sense of reverence for systemic natural complexity can support moral values that see our integration with nature as central to our salvation. His invocation of indigenous spiritual perspectives on interconnectedness is central to this emerging religious philosophy, offering a moral critique of the exploitative human-centered selfishness that still dominates our consumer society. Interestingly, sunlight reflection can only be effective as a cooling method if it has strong global governance arrangements, requiring just the sort of global connections that King Charles calls for. COP28, Faith for Climate Call to Action, also focused on the theme of interconnection, saying our common values inspire and unite us in our efforts to combat the human-made climate crisis and to nurture the sacredness and well-being of all life on Earth. Love for our world and for each other, and awareness of our interconnectedness underpin our understanding and our commitment to urgent action. Similar themes were expressed by Pope Francis in his 2015 encyclical on the climate crisis, Laudate Si', calling for an integral ecology that would care equally for humanity and for nature, grounded in Christian faith. The importance of these ideas is in finding a middle way between the heedless consumerism of mass society and the misanthropic science that views humanity as a plague, creating inevitable apocalyptic collapse. The upshot of these religious themes is that addressing the challenge of sustaining planetary peace and prosperity for 8 billion people in ways that can protect and enhance biodiversity requires focus on ethical values that have been central to religion and theology. The work of the radical German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer is immensely helpful in casting light on the moral problems in climate and ecology. Dr. Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor who was executed by the Nazis in 1945 for plotting to kill Hitler. He's celebrated for putting the story of Jesus Christ at the center of his theology in ways that engage with secular philosophy. A key part of this outlook was his critique of the individualism of the modern world. Bonhoeffer argued that the priority given to personal autonomy in modern culture had allowed a collapse of community and of the social dialogue needed to build shared understanding. Grounding this social dialogue in the biblical story of Christ was, for Bonhoeffer, a way to ensure a responsible moral vision. He explored this goal in the context of existential philosophy, using Martin Heidegger's observation that human existence is intrinsically relational. A relational philosophy starts from the observation that we're always living with other people, immersed in a world of shared care and concern and connection. It's only secondary that we are the isolated, doubting individuals, as posited by the scientific worldview. This relational perspective from Bonhoeffer can bring some essential themes into climate debate. Looking at global warming against the gospel story of Christ offers some useful insights without allowing the supernatural content of conventional faith to detract from its contemporary meaning. One important area is how Christianity presents history with a grand sweeping vision, seeing the world as on a trajectory of decline that requires a global paradigm shift to reverse, to create a trajectory of ascent. The political paralysis in the face of global warming presents this syndrome of cultural decline in an advanced state. Bonhoeffer's writings suggest a clash between rival visions of faith. The imperial faith of Christendom gives priority to using religion for social control through what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. The contrasting vision of the messianic faith of the Gospels, especially the Sermon on the Mount, imagines how our world could be transformed through shared spiritual values of truth, love, and justice. Imperial faith is sending us to hell, whereas messianic faith could build heaven on earth. Bonhoeffer's engagement with secular philosophy and politics led him to hold views about God and religion that some conservative Christians would see as heretical. As we look at how faith can engage constructively on climate policy, it's useful to consider how views initially seen as marginal are often eventually recognized as true. In this, I have in mind heretical forms of Christianity that can give an absolute priority to evidence and logic as moral principles. Just as Christianity has its orthodoxy and its heretics, so too climate science has produced fundamental clashes between insiders and outsiders, especially around geoengineering, which is now almost totally excluded from formal consideration by governments. In both religion and climate policy, completely mythical beliefs can quite easily gain popular support when they engage with what people earnestly want to be true. The science is clearly settled on the causes of climate change, but not on what can be done about it. One interesting example of a heretical belief in biblical scholarship is the argument that Jesus Christ was an entirely fictional character, a very challenging view that completely contradicts Orthodox faith at a similar world scale to how calls for albedo enhancement contradict the Orthodox climate dogma of emission reduction alone. Although it's mainly advanced by non-Christians, the Christ myth theory could also offer a basis to reform Christianity to become compatible with science in a way that remains supportive of Christian faith. Scholars such as Dr. Richard Carrier have shown that the historical Jesus described in the Gospels is basically absent from the epistles of Paul, and that the story of Jesus of Nazareth comes from a single source, the Gospel of Mark. Jesus differs from other famous historical individuals who generally have multiple independent lines of evidence for their existence and are not embedded in a miraculous backstory. Other research has found cosmic motifs in the Gospels, indicating Jesus was invented on a stellar blueprint as a personification of the sun, based on observation of precession of the equinox. Such heretical ideas are shocking and unacceptable to conventional Christianity, which sees the real historical existence of Jesus as a cornerstone of faith. The idea that the whole Jesus story could be an invention is usually rejected out of hand, yet it's a strongly argued and coherent scholarly line of thinking. The implication for climate policy is in what these observations suggest about the psychology of mass delusion and the power of imagination. If it's true that Jesus was invented, it's astounding that this fact could have been so successfully concealed by the church. Most people today view this as unbelievable. Yet the syndrome of motivated reasoning, where people believe what they want to believe and disregard the rest, is well documented, although not on such an audacious scale. The human mind is wired to accept comforting emotional fantasies rather than unwelcome facts. This syndrome gives grounds for suspicion about popular views on climate change. As with Jesus, hope is more powerful than evidence as the basis for belief in the power of emission reduction. It's obvious that climate denial is a mythological fantasy since it's so easily debunked by facts. But the net zero story is far more complex, given that it's broadly supported by the scientific community, whose core values are meant to be evidence and logic. The idea that the world must rapidly decarbonize as the top priority plays into the psychology of emotional comfort as a source of hope to overcome the despair that people naturally feel about the prospect of a climate apocalypse, and as a way to interpret climate change as a struggle of good against evil. These motivations are religious in nature, and therefore are resistant to scientific evidence that questions their basis. I would like to see the hope that people vest in decarbonising transfer to rebrightening as a more scientific and practical response to global warming, able to gain broader support once it receives serious scientific assessment. That's not at all to criticise the need for cutting emissions, just to put the carbon problem on a realistic and pragmatic timeframe and sequence. Otherwise, the problem is that by setting an unfeasible goal, the end result will be far worse, because key intermediate steps in the critical cooling path will be missed, and essential time will be lost to squabbling and inaction. The first step to rebrighten the planet should be, in my view, to aim for deployment of marine cloud brightening. For example, Australia could easily do this within its national waters or in adjacent international waters in ways that would not affect any other countries but would demonstrate the high value of cooling. To conclude, human psychology rests strongly upon mythological reasoning, even within supposedly scientific arguments about climate policy. This observation gives reason to see the call for a narrow focus on emission reduction as a quasi-religious myth. It's important to respect religious psychology, as it often contains deeper truths beneath an inaccurate surface story. At the same time, it's essential to open dialogue to explore how the objectives can actually be achieved, in this case, ensuring the livability of our planet. The strong scientific case for brightening the planet indicates the need for a paradigm shift in climate policy to research how increasing planetary albedo could stabilise the climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I'm sure you've invoked a lot of curiosity and comment. So I'm going to ask folks to raise their hands if they have a question or a comment that they'd like to make. And I might also start us off with a question that you've posited a lot with a lot of biblical reference and a long history of the psychology of religious thought and belief. And I'm wondering, in terms of putting the two together, the message that you're advocating and the direction that you're advocating, what would that sound like? What would the narrative be, and who would it be targeted to transition the mindset to a different place that's willing to accept climate denial?
Okay, I see the target audience as people who are essentially perplexed about the weirdness of the climate debate. You know, why is it that we have this assumptions that just don't seem to be offering any prospect of fixing the problem? And is it useful to think about the philosophical presuppositions, the underlying assumptions that that lead us to our popular conclusions, and so that thinking through the philosophy as it relates to theology, psychology, can just generate a better strategic understanding of the situation. So I think it's quite difficult to engage with climate deniers, except to the extent that I think that there's, I mean, my sense is that the prospect of rapid decarbonisation is really quite remote, and that's something that climate deniers see as just obvious. You know, they say, you know, our fossil fuel economy is so vast and so central to our prosperity that just shutting it down, you know, cutting emissions in half by 2030, as the UN proposes, is just laughable. And so, if it's possible to say, okay, we can have a more gradual transition path that accepts a slower shift away from fossil fuels while actually fixing the heat problem by geoengineering. That's not to place geoengineering as a substitute for emission reduction. It's simply to combine them, to integrate them on a realistic trajectory. So it's, I think there are audiences there, both in conservative and in progressive communities.
Okay, thank you. We have Robert Chris, whom you referenced in your presentation. So let's see what Robert has to say and ask.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for referencing me in your presentation. I'm honoured that you did so. And I really, just to make the observation that the comment about complex adaptive systems, which I have talked about before, I think in this group, allows it totally encompasses much of what you've spoken about. So, you know, I'm not going to talk now about the climate science. I think we're all broadly on the same page with that, on that. And although I am certainly not of a religious disposition, I entirely recognise the role that religion can play, and indeed does play, in both positive and negative ways, much like any other element of the human system, where things operate in a variety of different forms. And the magic of complex adaptive systems is that the interactions between the various elements, and the elements are not just the human beings, the elements are the human beings and all of the things that with which we engage, both living things and inorganic things. The things that emerge from these interactions are quintessentially unpredictable, and they are then selected by some, or what's referred to as an autonomous process, so that some of them are just simply rejected as being useless, and others are promoted and enhanced and become built into the system, and that's how systems develop and move forward. And I think much of what you've said, Robert, with regard to the potential for religious thinking to contribute in a positive way to the dilemmas that the dilemma that humanity is currently facing is, you know, I think it's brilliant. I mean, I have no issue with it at all, and one needs to encourage that. I'm not qualified to do that, but you know, to the extent that there are those out there, and you mentioned many in your talk, that absolutely should be encouraged. So yeah, I'm totally behind that. So I just want to make one other, what I think is a correction. You said that you referred to the doomsters, whose view was that nothing. I think what you said was nothing, that nothing can be done. Now I have to say that I do classify myself as a doomster, but I don't classify myself as a doomster because I don't think that anything can be done. In fact, quite the contrary. I think an awful lot can be done. I'm a doomster because I don't think that we will actually do it, because we don't have the wit, put it bluntly, to get our shit together to make it happen now at the speed and scale that's necessary. And that's why I'm a doomster, not because I don't think we don't have the solutions. We've never been short of things that we could do that would be hugely effective, but we have now just run out of road. And I think that's the problem. And I think that whilst I am totally on side with the science as you've described it this evening, and the need for albedo enhancement, and the prospect that albedo enhancement has to steady the ship, so to speak, whilst we migrate to a non fossil fuel economy over decades. I agree, it isn't going to happen overnight. I just can't see how that can happen quickly enough for us to be ahead of the tipping point curve. And that's why I'm a doomster, not because I don't think it can happen, but because I think it won't happen. So I'll leave it with that, but a great talk, a really, really excellent talk. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Robert. And I as I say, I think that your work on complex adaptive systems offers some really valuable philosophical insight into the whole climate problem. And I find it interesting to put it into this sort of religious context of interconnectivity of everything. And so I suppose I think that there's the potential for religion to engage a mass audience, which I think has got the potential to create sudden change. And obviously, here we are talking among ourselves with 15 people, but I think that if some of these sorts of debates could get into the mass media, then there's the potential for sudden shifts of thinking, because I suppose I see public policy in a sort of tectonic way. That the subterranean pressures build up invisibly over a long period of time, and then you get a sudden earthquake where suddenly the whole situation is just transformed, and that's what I think is coming with climate change, because I found the strangeness of the COP28 really quite bizarre, and the ability to open up a conversation about why is it so strange. I just find that these sorts of conversations are just completely excluded from public view. And I'd love to be able to speak in the media about these sorts of things, and just finding a way to do so coherently. I really value the opportunity to share with this audience to get to try to get my ideas in a more coherent frame and test them out. And so I do think that there's the prospect for sudden shifts in psychology and politics that can overcome the risk of collapse. Thanks, Robert.
Can I just come back on that very briefly? I don't dispute that there is the potential for that kind of paradigm shift, where you get a sudden realization, oh my God, we've got it wrong, we've got to do something differently. And the thinking that people like us and others have done kind of presents the solutions, if you like, or the actions on a plate. This is what we've got to do, right, let's go and do it. And that can happen very suddenly. My issue is actually at a very much more sort of pragmatic scale, that in order to realize that, to operationalize it at scale and at the speed that I think is now necessary, just the materials handling, the engineering capacity just the sheer physical scale of the infrastructure that needs to be constructed in the time that is likely to be available. I just find that really daunting. And I'm not at all convinced that it is feasible.
Well, I think that the speed that vaccines were developed for COVID is a good model for how the speed of, for example, deployment of marine cloud brightening could be achieved. And I think that Jim Hansen's description of marine cloud brightening as the most innocuous way to introduce cooling is really valuable, because it's something that could be done real, chuck $20 million at it, and we'd be doing it straight away, and that could then provide a demonstration effect to the public of the value of it, and opening up concepts like cooling return on investment as things that offer a serious challenge to our conventional climate thinking. Thanks, Robert. Let's, if you don't mind, let's go on to Ron and Aria.
Ron, you're up.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, I enjoyed your talk, and I was also sort of taken by philosophy when I was young, and eventually gravitated to other things. But I think I think we can. Obviously, on the climate front, I think we're all pretty much on the same page, as Robert said, at least in this group, as far as I know. On the issue of religion, though, I think I see it as a cultural pathway to reach people, and to reach people in a positive way, both for progressive change and for social political change, for climate struggle, there are multiple examples of religion playing a positive role in various struggles, social struggles, and that's for the good. The problem, of course, and it may be more obvious here in the U.S. than it is in Australia, because we have a big religious problem here, and the problem is that the methodology of religion is pre-modern. It's not based on evidence and reason. It's based on the wisdom of the Holy Bible, the Holy Book, or the ancient priests, and it tends to be very hierarchical and very, very sort of it becomes a barrier to reason and evidence. And that's I think if what your talk kind of reminds me. I have a friend who is a radical feminist, and she claims she's a fairly Orthodox Jew, and she picks out these parts of the Bible that she says support feminism. I said, well, your sort of progressive viewpoints are coming from a modern liberal pluralist scientific based understanding of the world, and you're just cherry picking out of these ancient traditions the things that make sense. And there's a lot of wisdom in the ancient traditions. I mean, you've mentioned the Eastern traditions with their much more encompassing view of nature is not something to be conquered, but something to be live in harmony with, and similarly with a lot of the indigenous traditions. So there's lots of wisdom, but I think anyway, but I don't want to harp on that, because I think as a cultural means to reach people, it's important. There's no question, and it's great that you're doing this. You're trying to do this. I do though. Just one last point. I do take issue with the notion that you can sort of make an analogy between progressives who are so sort of caught up in the struggle against the fossil fuel interests, the power that's been going on again in the U.S. especially, that they really do tend to have a good versus evil. And we have to basically we have to just have a revolution and do away with fossil fuels, and that's the solution to climate change. I mean, that's a political position that I agree with you that, is problematic at this point, very problematic, but you can kind of understand where that comes from. It's not, that kind of a political position is not the same as religion. It's just people getting caught up in a politics that's no longer constructive. So I don't think it's really a fair analogy to these religious zealots that we're seeing now. We're seeing in Israel, we're seeing in the Middle East, we're seeing in the religious right. I mean, all over the world, these religious zealots are just creating mayhem and destruction and horrible catastrophe. So that's there are deeper problems here. But anyway, I'll shut up.
Thanks
That's
very
enough.
much, Ron.
Thank you. Yeah.
If I could just respond to a couple of themes there. I don't see it so. For example, I use the verses, "The meek will inherit the earth," and that the wrath of God will destroy those who destroy the earth. Now, to me, those are texts that are really valuable in developing an ecological spirituality, and they indicate a what you call a sort of wisdom tradition that was underlying the biblical vision. And so it's whereas, as I was alluding, the whole of Christendom sort of took that original wisdom tradition and said, okay, we're going to use this for imperial stability. And so they were the ones who did the cherry picking. They essentially distorted the original message to say, this all serves the interests of the empire, and anything that conflicts with the interests of empire, we'll just if you promote that, then we'll kill you. And so we've got like 2,000 years of this misuse of the Gospels. But my view is that if you go back to the original document, then it's possible to find a sort of coherent scientific vision within it, even within the context that they had very limited, empirical knowledge of the universe at that time. But within their context, I feel that there's a deep wisdom that can be. It's like a new Reformation, like putting the Bible onto a completely scientific basis. We had a partial Reformation with Protestantism, and then it's possible to deepen that Reformation by just putting it onto a complete, so for example, saying all miracles are just parables, just taking the sort of hermeneutic of suspicion. That's one of the methods that was promoted by Nietzsche and Freud. So we've got the ability to use modern philosophy to critique religion in a constructive way. And I just have to differ with you, Ron, on whether there's a mythological basis around the popular climate movement. I think that analogy is quite apt, and so it's good to I think I take your point, but I just see it a bit differently. So thank you.
Thank you. And Aria, you had a comment.
Yes, I did. Can see me okay. Robert, first of all, I just really want to thank you for this. I think this is a really important conversation, the one in regards to religion, especially. And I want to tell you that this conversation was really valuable to me in my work. I'm currently very close to finalizing my pilot for Revolution Earth, and the central character, religion plays a very large role in her upbringing, and so I did not grow up with religion, so I have been wanting to find those seeds to integrate into the storyline to help make the points that you're making here and to find connectivity among the characters. So I just want to tell you that this is really valuable, and there were nice little nuggets that I'm going to be using as takeaways. And I might want to reach out to you again. I'm going to watch this over again And I might want to, talk to you more about this if you're amenable. I think it's a really important conversation, and that's exactly what I want to do, is reach these larger audiences, engage them in the realities of the climate crisis, and find a way to reach them where they're at. So I think this is really an important part of that strategy, honoring people and with the best of what religion has to offer them, and to tie them in with the better messages that are coming out of it, so they don't feel alienated in the work that we're doing. So yeah, so I just wanted to.
That's great, Aria. Thank you. And so I was essentially like I find that to present these things in a productive way, I write them down. So like I was just reading from a document that I've written. So I'm happy to circulate that. And if HPAC would like to publish that on the website, then that's very welcome.
That would be awesome. So and I just think that this is and I also really appreciate you still having hope. And I think that the key is reaching those large audiences, creating the cultural shifts that we need to make. And that's where the hope lies to me, that we can start implementing these strategies and larger ideas. And then from there, we can figure out to what degree, how quickly we can make the transition that we need to make. But we've already had conversations about, getting off fossil fuels. I think is a necessary part to do as quickly as possible. And I think it's important to hold on to the hope of our ability to do that. But clearly, we can't hold on to that hope while ignoring the reality that we're facing in terms of what needs to be done to give us the time to do it. So, yeah.
And I think, Aria, it's really important that, as you say, like I see considerable grounds for hope in the sort of ideas that I've been expressing, and so I'm actually really optimistic. I know Robert Chris expressed a very rational grounds for pessimism, but I am optimistic about the potential to change, and I think that we've seen big changes in human thinking in the past, and it's similar scale of sudden change of thinking is entirely possible as long as it can be coherently explained. Thank you.
Yeah. And we just have to reach people where they're at and find ways in beyond the kinds of conversations we've been having. So, but I see that happening right now. There is a lot of movement in the entertainment industry, and there are a lot of people I've been having conversations with that are bringing in more parts of that to make the cultural shift. So.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bruce, you have a comment or a question?
Yeah. First, well, thank you, Robert. It's very compelling. I enjoyed your talk. And Robert, Chris, and this for everyone, for hope. The amount of money that we spent in World War II, when you adjust it for gross domestic product change from World War II to today, it's $42 trillion a year for 7 years, 300 and some odd $1 trillion in 7 years. That, however, is based on motivation. In order to spend that kind of money, we have to be strongly motivated, which that I think is a source of a lot of folks' pessimism about our future, and we know what to do, but we're not going to do it.
The trouble is, though, Bruce, sorry to cut in, but we don't know what to do. Like implementing a rebrightening program would cost of the order of billions of dollars a year, and not trillions. now, decarbonizing the world economy would cost trillions, and that's the basis of the pushback. You know, people like we see it in Australia with people saying, you know, our government is saying we want to spend you know, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars on completely decarbonizing the energy system. And there's this really big, you know, conservative reaction against that says, you know, just that's just flatly ridiculous. And so you've got this extreme polarization in the debate, and I just think that there's a sort of cutting the Gordian knot that says, well, you know, we can actually stop the warming temporarily by spending billions on a world scale, which is easily affordable. And you know, it's nothing like the scale, but what is of the scale of World War II is the threat, because you know, there's the risk of you know, just mass migration and conflict and you know, ecological collapse that will cause suffering on a similar scale to World War II. So you know, we don't need to spend $500 trillion to fix the problem. And so you know, it's possible to create a message that the issue can be solved. So yeah, sorry to jump in, but you had more to say.
Yeah, well, you're just illustrating a lot of the contemporary thought about the challenge. When I say we know what to do, I'm talking about carbon dioxide removal and geoengineering. Emissions reductions is a very tiny part of the solution. And so one of the things that I have interpreted, I say a lot, is that we do not, the science does not tell us that emissions reductions are mandatory. This is what the scenarios say. Our climate culture is deeply embedded in the scenarios that are all future warming scenarios, all warming to 1.5C. I'm speaking of the accepted over 1,000 scenarios of IPCC's AR6. So the concept.
I know. Yeah, you've written about that considerably, Bruce, and I appreciate that. My view on carbon dioxide removal is that what will be needed is technologies to convert carbon dioxide into useful commodities. And I see that as entirely possible. I particularly like the work of my colleague Brian von Hertzen in marine permaculture, and just the idea that it's possible to scale up that sort of operation for products like biochar and concrete and materials and also fuel in ways that's at the multi-gigaton scale. Now, it'll take quite a while to develop that, but I really just don't like the idea of sequestering CO2 on the model of enhanced oil recovery. You know, I just think that that's a very you know, ineffective. Like there's no income stream for geosequestration. But you know, it's and I agree with you actually, and I think that this is a critical point, that that this sort of conversion of carbon dioxide into non-warming forms and locations is going to be a much bigger part of the solution than cutting emissions, because like, so say we're, you know, currently emitting, as I mentioned, 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. If it proves possible to convert 100 gigatons of carbon dioxide into useful products each year, then it means that emissions can continue on a path to planetary stability. Now that's something that will develop over the next century. But I think that we're seeing carbon dioxide removal or conversion. You know, we're essentially at the Kitty Hawk stage that aviation was at more than a century ago. And, you know, we need to move to the A380 stage, but it's that sort of, you know, technological advance that will enable the solution of the carbon problem, which of course is a major issue as far as ocean acidity is concerned. And, you know, but the problem of ocean acidity can't be used as a reason to do nothing about albedo, which is the current consensus argument, which is really facile and stupid. You know, we need to work on albedo and recognize that, you know, addressing the acidity and also the I mean, the other issue is the termination shock issue. Just like we need to cooperate in order to restore Holocene CO2 levels, but that'll take a long time. It's not going to happen, you know, within decades. It's a sort of multi-century trajectory.
I disagree on that. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I want to get to the meat of my subject. And part of it is his motivation thing with $42 trillion a year appropriately motivated. We can draw down atmospheric CO2 in a very fast way in just a couple of decades. But our timelines are much shorter than that, with tipping active threatening to become irreversible. We've got to use direct cooling to try and mitigate for the tipping, because once the tipping systems really get moving, and they're really moving now, the feedback emissions just overwhelm everything. So my point was just that there is hope, because we have done this before. However, we have to be appropriately motivated. Now, to further the conversation about religion and climate change, Katharine Hayhoe, I think everybody knows. Does anybody not know Katharine Hayhoe, who she is?
I remember, but just remind us of her position.
She's Texas-based, has a global platform, significant faith-based, atmospheric scientist, 150 papers to her name. She speaks in very plain English, so she's a really good spokesperson for a lot of civilians. And she's in Lubbock, Texas Tech, very faith-based community up there. It's just part of her platform, is speaking to the faith-based population. But she is deeply mired in the moral hazard and emissions reductions alone. My question is, this to anybody, not just Robert, how can we use religion to come back at her, to get her to better consider restoration when tipping systems are active? I mean, we've got 1.5C probably going to be popped this year, if not certainly by a large margin next year, which is going to be a huge motivating factor. But I still believe that the emissions reduction alone culture is going to persist, because it's so deeply entrenched. So does anybody have any thoughts about how to address somebody with such a large platform like this? It's kind of the same thing of getting them to switch from IPCC scenarios to restoration to the true science that says we've got to reduce the energy imbalance. Any ideas?
Well, that's exactly what I'm interested to do. So thank you, Bruce, for raising that. And I think, as Aria has commented in the chat, that, you know, reaching out to people like Katharine Hayhoe is offers just the potential for a courteous dialogue in ways that can just explore the basis of different perspectives on the issue, and, you know, try to you know, look through. The way I see it is in terms of paradigm shift, and that the anomalies in the old paradigm have accumulated to an extent that it's broken, and but that what's required is a new coherent paradigm that can offer a path forward. And so it's where I think that's entirely possible. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. A topic for future discussion. We're closing in on 2:48. Chris, Robert, I see you have your hand up again, but I'm going to give Mike McCracken an opportunity to speak first, and then we'll come back to you and wrap up. So, Mike, you need to unmute.
Yeah, I actually just have a question. It should be very brief here. When you say it's so costly to change over to these new systems, actually, solar and wind and
we hope the water power we generate are going to be less expensive. I mean, all these systems that exist today are going to have to be replaced. And I guess what I'm wondering is are the large costs you estimating taking account of the investments that would have to be made to keep the fossil fuel system going? I mean, the estimates we have, for example, for the United States, if we were to put in a high voltage direct current supplement to our transmission system so we could move solar energy across the, long distances from where it's best made to where it's needed, are that would actually cut the cost of electricity to people, that it would actually be a net savings. If we get so we can put hydrogen into some of the existing machinery and everything, some of that can be adjusted without having to replace every machine and everything all over the country. So I guess I'm wondering about your cost estimate of saying it's so impossibly hard to be pushing on intervention. I mean, the problem is it's an upfront cost to do a lot of these things, and some of the others are amortized more over time. But I'm really wondering about the cost, which is said to be, only 1% or 2% of the GDP over time or something.
Yeah, it's equally an opportunity cost, Mike, because I think it's, of course, it's possible to sorry, I've got a request to record this meeting locally, but I'm just not going to follow that up. So if the opportunity cost is seen that decarbonizing and brightening the planet are alternatives, then the cost of decarbonizing is clearly far higher than the cost of the cooling return
Pulling
on
CO2
investment.
out is expensive. Yeah, no question about
that.
Yeah.
And I see we have a lot of debate here in Australia about the high cost of new transmission systems that are needed to bring energy from solar and wind locations. And I find it interesting that there's this debate about nuclear, the idea that small modular nuclear reactors could be located on the sites of coal-fired power stations to essentially plug in a dispatchable power that would not require new infrastructure. So there's a whole series of debates, and I really welcome all of the different perspectives that there are on these questions. I would just like to see really solid scientific research that assesses all of these different ideas, so that this policy can be based on evidence rather than ideology. That's the goal, I suppose.
Okay. And Robert, Chris, last words?
Yes, just real quickly, I want to pick up on Bruce's point about this idea of the comparison with being on a war footing, because it's something that I understand is a very attractive metaphor, but I think it's actually very misleading and inappropriate. One of the other things which you'll find out about if you should, like Robert, read my book, is the notion of wicked problems. And if you're not familiar with wicked problems, then just Google wicked problems and you'll find out about them. But fighting a war is essentially a tame problem. You have an enemy, you go out and kill him, end problem solved. Climate change is not like that. It is not a tame problem. Climate change is a genuinely wicked problem. And that's why it is so difficult. So the war footing metaphor is appropriate in terms of we've got to act urgently and we can spend this money and we can incur the debt to do it. But the problem, exactly as Bruce was saying, is about the motivation. And the motivation to deal with the tame problem is very different from the motivation to deal with the wicked problem. Because with a wicked problem, you really don't know what you're getting into. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I suppose I see extreme weather as an entry point to overcome the wickedness, because like looking at the Hurricane Otis that smashed into Acapulco 2 months ago, it was essentially due to the high sea surface temperature. And if like one of the comments that I've been emphasizing is that if people had listened to John Latham a decade ago and had put resources into marine cloud brightening, then that sort of catastrophe could have been significantly mitigated in its impact, and so that it offers a path to, I suppose, see it as not so much a wicked problem, but as a soluble problem.
Okay, well,
Can I add one little bitty thing
sure,
about
Bruce.
wicked problem? I was a reader on a climate ethics thesis several years back that introduced me to wicked problems, and I do not believe that geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal is a wicked problem. I think the way that we're going about it with further warming with IPCC scenarios and largely emissions reductions is truly a wicked problem. But in no way do I think that climate pollution treatment with carbon dioxide removal and then emergency cooling with some form of direct cooling are any means wicked. They're simple tech processes. We know MCB intimately after 150 years of implementation, and the three carbon dioxide removal strategies that have been been in use for over 100 years. The three main ones are widespread in industry, and their components are even more widespread. So I do agree about the wickedness of emissions reductions, but not about restoration mitigation.
Thank you, Bruce.
Based on a system science.
Well, it sounds like we have a good topic for a future conversation. So we'll have to figure out how we might do phase 2 of this. I think Ron has some announcement about future meetings and what will be held and when. We're going to take a little break for the holiday season. So I'm going to turn it over to Ron and let him tell you what's happening in our future. And Ron?
Yes, thank you. Yep, thank you, Suzanne. I hope I get my date straight. So we are taking a break. HVAC is taking a break for the holidays, and we will reconvene on January 11th, Thursday, January 11th. So we're looking forward to that. We're trying to get some folks to talk about COP28 debrief. Robert generously sort of pinch hit for us here because we were hoping to have some people today, but that didn't work out. So anyway, so we wish everyone here a good holidays, and we'll be back on the 11th with again, as I said, you know, some hopefully some speakers on COP28. In the meantime, we'll be you know, the steering committee will also be taking a break, but we will be working on things. We have a lot of things that you know, we can do without having to have a live Zoom meeting. I think that's it. Did I miss something?
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
So next general meeting, January 11th. Everyone have a happy holiday as you celebrate it. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Robert. Very enlightening. And if the steering circle members will stay on, please, we will see you all next year. Happy New Year.